In this study, we were able to include cycle infrastructure, which we identified through manual coding of Google Street View lookups at the different locations. Most of the infrastructure could most kindly be described as legacy in relation to current design standards, so it's worth remembering this when interpreting the results. We coded the infrastructure into two different types. So one type we called bike lanes. So bike lanes were defined as being painted on-road infrastructure without physical separation from motor vehicles. These lanes could be mandatory, which means that drivers are not meant to use them, or they could be advisory, which means that you're allowed to drive in them just as much as you're allowed to cycle in them. Most of them were advisory, often they were narrow. Now, we found that the presence of these lanes was associated with an increase in risk for people cycling, around 50% riskier. Similar findings also came from a study that looked specifically at London in relation to advisory cycle lanes. So it seems that painted infrastructure, while it's very common across Britain, doesn't seem to be keeping cyclists safer and may in fact be putting them at higher risk.
Why is this? There is some other evidence that the presence of marked cycle lanes can encourage drivers to feel they can pass cyclists more closely than if there was no lane marking.
We instrumented a bicycle with an ultrasonic distance meter and video cameras. We cycled a metre from the curb in conditions with a cycle lane and without, in 20, 30 and 40 mile an hour areas in many various locations in different cities in the north of England. And what we found from that research was that not untypically, when a cycle lane line was painted, drivers in fact did drive closer to the cyclist than when there wasn't cycle lane painted. And we think that this is probably because the drivers, when there is a cycle lane line, will drive up to the line either side of them, the centre line and the cycle lane line, without particularly due recognition of whether or not there's a cyclist in the cycle lane. And if the width is inappropriate, then in fact the passing distance to the cyclist may not be as large as it would have been had the driver had to perform an overtaking manoeuvre of the cyclist within one single lane. I think advisory cycle lanes and white paint in the road is still useful, but it has to be in the right context. I think the flows have to be not too high, the speeds need to be relatively limited,